At 37 years old, Michael Jackson had already lived a life bigger than most human beings could ever imagine. He had performed in front of millions, he had sold records by the hundreds of millions, he had reshaped music, dance, and entertainment in a way no one had before him. But for all that glory, one song stood apart, not because it topped charts, but because it revealed a truth so raw that Michael himself would later admit it was the loneliest cry of his career. That song was "Stranger in Moscow." On the surface, it's slow, haunting, almost painfully intimate. It doesn't have the big beats of Thriller or the catchy hooks of Bad. Instead, it drifts like a cold winter wind, carrying words that sound less like lyrics and more like a confession. How does it feel when you're alone and cold inside? Fans who listened closely heard the sadness, but few understood just how much truth those words carried. This wasn't a character he was playing. This wasn't the pop star mask. This was Michael Jackson, alone, scared, abandoned, and looking at a world that seemed to turn against him. And yet, why Moscow? Why did Michael, at the peak of his fame, tie his darkest feelings to a city thousands of miles from home? What had happened in those years to push him to such isolation? And what did he later reveal about this song that made it clear it wasn't just music, it was his personal cry for help? The answers are hidden in scandal, betrayal, and private notes that Michael left behind. And when he finally admitted the truth, it shocked even his most loyal fans. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter of Michael's life, make sure you're with us here on RetroWaves. This channel is where the curtain gets pulled back, where we don't just replay the hits. You can find those anywhere. We uncover the stories that shaped the songs, the confessions, the secrets, the heartbreaks, and the truths that the world almost missed. If you've ever felt the pull of nostalgia, if you've ever wondered what was really going on when the icons of music gave us their greatest hits, then RetroWaves is your home. So click subscribe, give this video a like, and join us on a journey through the music that defined our lives and the hidden stories behind it. Because this one, Michael's Loneliest song, will change the way you hear "Stranger in Moscow" forever. In the early 1990s, Michael Jackson seemed untouchable. His Dangerous tour was a global phenomenon, selling out massive arenas. His music videos, directed like short films, pushed boundaries and redefined what pop could be. To the world, he was still the king of pop, larger than life, adored on every continent. But in 1993, everything changed. That year, allegations surfaced that would forever haunt his name. For the first time in his career, Michael wasn't just facing critics of his music. He was facing suspicion, judgment, and headlines that painted him as something unrecognizable. He denied every accusation, and no criminal charges were ever filed. But the damage was done. The press tore him apart. Tabloids branded him with labels that stuck, regardless of truth. For Michael, who had spent his life creating art to bring people together, this was devastating. Friends turned silent. Business partners distanced themselves. Crowds that once screamed with joy now whispered with doubt. So Michael did what he had always done when the world became too much. He left. He fled the noise of America and found himself far from the cameras in Moscow. To outsiders, it looked like a tour stop, another concert in another city. But for Michael, Moscow was different. The Russian capital was cold, gray, distant. He didn't speak the language, he didn't have the comfort of home. Surrounded by bodyguards and translators, he was a man both protected and imprisoned. And it was there, in that lonely hotel room, that Michael picked up a pen and wrote the words that would become "Stranger in Moscow." Swift and sudden fall from grace, sunny days seem far away. Those weren't just lines in a song, they were his diary. They were his confession. He admitted later that "Stranger in Moscow" was born directly out of the feelings that consumed him in those days. Feelings of betrayal, abandonment, and cold isolation. Yet the world didn't fully understand. To many, it was just another track on an album. But for Michael, it was the song that said everything he couldn't say in interviews, everything he couldn't admit under the blinding spotlight of fame. The question is, what did Michael endure in Moscow that carved this pain so deeply into his music? What was he seeing, feeling, and fearing as he wrote one of his most personal songs? And why did he later say that this track, more than any other, revealed the darkest truth of his life? Those answers unfold in the haunting story of "Stranger in Moscow." Imagine being the most famous man on earth and feeling like you had no place to belong. That was Michael Jackson in Moscow, 1993. On paper, it was just another stop on the dangerous tour. Fans lined the streets in the freezing air, hoping for a glimpse of the king of pop. But inside his hotel, Michael was alone. He wasn't walking the streets freely, wasn't sightseeing, wasn't laughing with friends. He was locked away behind walls of security, pacing from room to room, staring out at a city that felt as cold as his own reality. For Michael, Moscow reflected his state of mind, a city cloaked in gray, distant, where even the cheers of fans outside couldn't drown out the silence inside. Witnesses from that time recalled that Michael looked withdrawn. Some said he hardly ate, others described him as moving like a ghost through the hotel, always trailed by bodyguards, never alone, but never truly with anyone either. And while the world only saw the star on stage, behind closed doors he was scribbling notes, fragments of thought, phrases that captured the way he felt abandoned, judged, and misunderstood. Kremlin's shadow belittling me, swift and sudden fall from grace. Those lyrics came straight from his Moscow days. They weren't carefully polished pop lines. They were raw. They were Michael's attempt to put into words the feeling of being exiled, not just from his country, but from the love of the world he once knew. It was in that frozen city that he realized the cost of fame, and it was in that silence that Stranger in Moscow was born. But what was he really trying to say with it? And why did the song sound so different from everything he had done before? The first notes of Stranger in Moscow came not as a dance track, not as a chart-chasing hit, but as a whisper on paper. Michael often said that songs came to him. They weren't forced. They arrived like visitors. And this one arrived during his loneliest hours. Unlike his upbeat anthems, this song had no glitter, no fireworks. It was slow, haunting, built around a soft beat that echoed like footsteps on empty streets. Every element felt like a reflection of his reality, cold, quiet, filled with echoes. Michael later admitted that this song was his direct response to the chaos of 1993, the accusations, the tabloid frenzy, the way his phone stopped ringing, the way people he trusted pulled away. He felt like a man abandoned, judged before trial, exiled in spirit. KGB was dogging me / take my name and just let me be. This wasn't paranoia, at least not entirely. While in Moscow, Michael was constantly watched, his every move shadowed by both his own team and by government officials, curious about the most famous visitor in the world. To Michael, it felt suffocating, like eyes were always on him, but no one was truly with him. The song was, in his own words, a reflection of depression and isolation. It wasn't designed for radio. It wasn't crafted for chart success. It was, he said, the most personal confession he had ever put to music. And yet, when it was finally released, many dismissed it. In America, it barely registered on the charts. Fans overseas embraced it more warmly, but the truth at the heart of the track went unnoticed. Michael had written a song that bared his soul. But instead of healing, it deepened the question. If the world couldn't hear his pain in these words, who was left to understand him? When Stranger in Moscow was finally released in 1996 as part of the History album, the timing couldn't have been more complicated. Michael's reputation in the United States was still under a cloud. Radio stations were hesitant. Record executives, once eager to promote anything with his name on it, were cautious. The song didn't storm the American charts. In fact, it barely made a ripple. For an artist used to dominating airwaves, this was painful. But outside the US, it was a different story. In Europe, the song climbed into the top 10 in several countries. In the United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy, listeners connected with its haunting honesty. Some critics praised the track as Michael's most vulnerable work. They said it stripped away the spectacle and revealed the man. Others, however, brushed it off as too dark, too slow, or even too personal. They expected Michael to be the eternal showman, not a man writing about depression and exile. But among fans, especially those who looked closer at the lyrics, there was a sense that Michael was crying out in a way he never had before. He wasn't dancing away the pain. He wasn't hiding behind metaphors of Billie Jean or thriller characters. This was direct, a wound set to music. And yet, for all that, the world moved on. The song didn't become a cultural moment like Beat It or Black or White. It slipped quietly into the catalog of Michael Jackson, waiting for years before many fans would revisit it and realize what he had truly been saying. But what exactly did those lyrics reveal about his state of mind? To understand Stranger in Moscow, you have to step into Michael's shoes at that exact moment. The line's swift and sudden fall from grace wasn't abstract. Just 3 years earlier, Michael had been at the Super Bowl, performing to one of the biggest audiences in television history. He had stood as a global icon of unity. Now, in his own words, he had fallen swiftly, suddenly, and brutally from that pedestal. The chorus asks, "How does it feel when you're alone and cold inside?" This wasn't rhetorical. It was Michael asking himself that question every day in that Moscow hotel room. And then there's the chilling reference, "KGB was dogging me." Some critics dismissed it as paranoia, but those close to Michael insisted that he often felt watched. In Russia, during the tense years after the Cold War, foreign stars were indeed monitored. Whether by officials or by his own team, Michael lived in a bubble where every movement was tracked. To him, it wasn't just oversight, it was suffocation. Another haunting line, Armageddon of the brain, Michael's way of describing the chaos inside his mind. The mental storm of being accused, ridiculed, and exiled. This wasn't about global events, it was about his inner war. Some rumors suggested that Michael used "Stranger in Moscow" as a coded message to those who had turned against him, but this has never been confirmed. What is clear is that every lyric bleeds with personal truth. It was a diary entry set to melody, one that told the world Michael Jackson wasn't invincible. He was human, fragile, and hurting. But years later, when asked directly about the song, Michael finally revealed just how deep it went. In interviews after "Stranger in Moscow" was released, Michael rarely spoke about the track in detail, but when he did, his words were striking. He admitted openly that the song captured his feelings of isolation during the darkest days of his life. He described it as being written at the height of my pain. For an artist who often kept his private struggles hidden, this was a rare confession. Michael explained that while he was in Moscow, he felt completely abandoned. People he trusted had turned away. Business associates he had once called friends had disappeared. The public, fed by sensational headlines, treated him like an outcast. And so, alone in that city, he poured everything into his music. "Stranger in Moscow" wasn't created for success, it was created for survival. In fact, Michael admitted that writing the song was a kind of therapy. It gave him a way to release emotions he couldn't share otherwise. On stage, he could smile. In public, he could put on the mask. But in music, especially here, he could confess. And what he confessed shook even his fans. This wasn't the confident king of pop, this wasn't the untouchable superstar. This was a man saying, "I'm alone, I'm broken, I'm hurting." Some people didn't want to hear that. They wanted the legend, not the man. But for those who did listen, the song became something more than a track. It became Michael Jackson's cry from the shadows. The question now is, did this cry ever get answered? Or did Michael remain a stranger, not just in Moscow, but everywhere he went? For years, "Stranger in Moscow" remained something of a hidden treasure in Michael Jackson's catalog. It wasn't a hit in the United States. It didn't become the soundtrack to commercials or movie scenes. But among dedicated fans, its reputation only grew stronger with time. Many began to see it as one of Michael's purest pieces of songwriting. Free of spectacle, free of showmanship, it was simply his voice, his words, and his feelings. Critics who had once brushed it off as too personal later revisited it and called it a masterpiece. Some even compared it to the raw confessions of artists like John Lennon during his most vulnerable years. Live performances of the song were rare, but when Michael did sing it, the atmosphere changed. The stadium energy of "Beat It" or "Smooth Criminal" gave way to silence. Fans described the air as heavy, as if everyone in the room felt the weight of his loneliness, and yet the mainstream largely overlooked it. In America, radio stations chose lighter, safer tracks. This song was too heavy, too sad, too honest. But for those who listened, it became a window into Michael's soul. The irony was hard to miss. Michael had finally written the song that showed the world who he really was, and the world barely paid attention. After Moscow and the release of "Stranger in Moscow," Michael's life never returned to what it had been before 1993. The accusations, even though unproven, followed him everywhere. Every interview, every appearance, carried the weight of suspicion. He continued to make music, of course. He released albums, toured the world, and still drew massive crowds. But beneath the surface, the loneliness remained. Those close to him often described him as kind, childlike, but deeply guarded. Trust, once broken, never fully came back. In later years, Michael himself admitted that fame had become a prison. He loved performing, he loved creating, but he also longed for normalcy, for a quiet walk, for friendships without conditions, for a life where he could simply exist without being judged. Stranger in Moscow had been his diary entry from one of his darkest chapters, but it wasn't the last time he felt that way. As the years went on, his isolation only deepened. Rumors spread constantly about his health, his finances, his relationships. Some of those stories were true, many were not, but the effect was the same. They pushed him further into solitude. Looking back, the song feels like a warning, a message from Michael to the world. This is what your judgment is doing to me. And tragically, the warning went unheard. Today, Stranger in Moscow is often looked at differently than it was in 1996. For many fans, it has become Michael's emotional will, his attempt to leave behind a truth that interviews, press conferences, and staged appearances never captured. Younger generations discovering the song on streaming platforms describe it as one of his most haunting works. For them, it's less about chart success and more about honesty. They see it as a glimpse of the man behind the mask, the human being who carried the burden of being Michael Jackson. Some even interpret it as a prophecy. They hear the lyrics, "How does it feel when you're alone and cold inside?" and connect them to Michael's later years when he withdrew more and more from public life. Of course, whether he meant it as a prophecy or simply as a diary of that time, only Michael knew for sure. What is certain is that the song now stands as one of the rare times he allowed the world to see his scars, and it raises a haunting question. If the world had listened more closely in 1996, would we have understood him better? Would history have judged him differently? The climax of Michael Jackson's story with Stranger in Moscow is not a performance, not a chart ranking, but the confession itself. Here was a man known for moonwalks, glitter gloves, and stadium-shaking choruses. Yet in this moment, stripped of all spectacle, he gave us silence, sadness, and vulnerability. It was the complete opposite of what the world expected from him. The song's climax is in the repetition of its central question, how does it feel? It's almost as if Michael was asking us directly, not just telling his story, but begging the world to step into his shoes, to feel what it was like to be praised one day and torn down the next, to feel the sting of betrayal, to feel the cold silence of a hotel room in a foreign city, when the whole world knows your name but no one knows your pain. This was the same man who once sang, "You are not alone." Yet here, he admitted that he himself was very much alone. For fans who truly listened, it was heartbreaking. For critics, it was proof that Michael was unraveling. But for Michael, it was release. He once said, "I write the songs to express the things I can't say," and in this song, he said it all. Years later, when people looked back at Michael's catalog after his passing, many pointed to Stranger in Moscow as the moment we should have paid more attention to, not because it was a hit, but because it was a warning, a confession hidden in plain sight. And the haunting part is this: the song doesn't end with triumph. It doesn't end with hope. It ends unresolved, just like Michael's own life. The last notes fade into silence, leaving us with the question echoing in our ears, how does it feel? So what do we make of Stranger in Moscow today? It stands as a rare glimpse into Michael Jackson's inner world, a world that was often hidden behind masks of performance and spectacle. In this one track, the king of pop lowered the crown and admitted that even kings can be lonely. For fans, the lesson is clear. Fame is not freedom. Success is not always joy. Even the man who seemed to have everything, money, talent, adoration, could feel like a stranger in his own skin.